There is a dangerous misunderstanding people make about empathetic individuals. They think soft people are weak people. They assume patience means passivity. They confuse forgiveness with surrender. They mistake emotional kindness for emotional blindness. But what most people never realize is this: empaths are not fragile because they feel deeply. They are powerful because they survive what would emotionally destroy most people. And the moment you push an empath beyond their emotional limit, something changes permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, coldly, permanently, because the most dangerous version of an empath is not the emotional one. It is the emotionally detached one. You see, empathetic people study human behavior constantly. Even when they say nothing, they are observing everything. Tone changes, energy shifts, fake concern, forced affection, hidden disrespect, manipulation disguised as love. They notice what others miss because emotional. Intelligence trains the brain to detect inconsistencies. That is why many empaths stay silent longer than expected. Not because they are unaware, but because they are collecting evidence emotionally. Most people think an empath keeps forgiving because they are naive. Wrong. Empaths often understand the truth long before they confront it. They simply hope people will choose honesty before consequences become irreversible. But repeated emotional pain changes human psychology, especially for someone who feels everything intensely. At first, an empath will communicate. They will explain. They will try to repair. They will ask questions. They will attempt understanding. Because emotionally intelligent people naturally search for solutions before separation. But when empathy is repeatedly met with manipulation, the brain begins adapting for survival. This is where the transformation begins. Slowly, the empath stops reacting emotionally, and most people completely misread this stage. They think, good, they're finally calming down. They are disconnecting. There is a massive psychological difference between emotional peace and emotional shutdown. Peace still contains warmth. Shutdown contains distance. And once emotional detachment begins, the relationship is already entering its final stage, because human connection survives through emotional investment. The moment the empath no longer emotionally invests, the emotional structure collapses silently. What makes this dangerous is that many manipulators only feel powerful when they can trigger reactions. They feed on emotional access, arguments, begging, crying, explaining, defending. These reactions reassure them that they still control the emotional atmosphere. But when the empath suddenly becomes calm, something terrifying happens psychologically. Control disappears. The manipulator can no longer predict emotional responses. And unpredictability creates anxiety. That is why emotionally harmful people often become more aggressive when an empath becomes quiet, because silence removes their influence. This is an important psychological principle. People become uncomfortable when their emotional control over others disappears. And empaths eventually reach a stage where they no longer seek validation from the people hurting them. That moment changes everything, because emotionally detached empathy is incredibly difficult to manipulate. Now understand this carefully. Empaths do not become heartless. After pain, they become selective. That is the difference. Pain teaches pattern recognition. After enough betrayal, the empath stops ignoring red flags. They stop over-explaining themselves. They stop chasing closure. They stop forcing connection. They stop trying to save people who enjoy causing damage. And this transformation shocks everyone around them. Why? Because people become addicted to the emotional safety empaths provide. Empaths listen deeply, support consistently, forgive repeatedly, understand emotionally. Most people never realize the value of that emotional presence until it disappears. And when it disappears, the emotional environment changes immediately. Suddenly, the warmth is gone. The reassurance is gone. The emotional availability is gone. And many people experience psychological withdrawal without understanding why. Because they were consuming emotional energy they never appreciated. This is why breaking an empath often creates regret later. Not because the empath seeks revenge, but because their absence exposes what their presence was protecting people from. Loneliness, emotional confusion, lack of understanding, internal emptiness. The empath was carrying emotional weight silently the entire time. And once they stop carrying it, everyone finally feels how heavy it truly was. There is another mistake people make. They think emotional people cannot become emotionally disciplined. Actually, the opposite is often true. The deepest feelers eventually become the strongest observers. Because pain sharpens awareness. An empath who survives betrayal develops extraordinary emotional control. They learn who drains energy, who manipulates sympathy, who lies through charm, who performs kindness strategically. And once these patterns become visible, the empath becomes extremely difficult to deceive again. This is where emotional maturity evolves into emotional power. Not loud power, controlled power. The kind that no longer needs approval. The kind that can walk away without explanation. The kind that understands silence is sometimes stronger than confrontation. That is why emotionally evolved empaths become intimidating to manipulative personalities. Because manipulation only works on people desperate for emotional connection. A healed empath is no longer emotionally desperate. They can love deeply without abandoning themselves. That changes everything. Now here is the part most people are not prepared for. When an empath finally stops caring, it usually means they cared too much for too long. Emotional shutdown rarely happens suddenly. It happens after repeated disappointment, repeated disrespect, repeated emotional imbalance, repeated betrayal. Eventually, the nervous system protects itself by reducing emotional attachment. Psychologists call this emotional withdrawal after prolonged stress exposure. And once this state fully develops, reconnecting becomes extremely difficult, because the empath remembers everything emotionally, not just words, patterns, energy, behavior consistency. And trust, once psychologically broken repeatedly, does not rebuild easily. This is why many people panic after losing an empath. They assume, I can get them back later. But emotionally detached empaths often never return psychologically. Even if they return physically for a short time, emotionally they are already gone. And that realization creates regret stronger than anger ever could. Because humans often ignore value while it is available. Only absence creates clarity. This message is not about fear. It is about awareness. People must understand that empathetic individuals are not emotional tools designed for endless sacrifice. They are human beings with emotional limits. And the more emotionally intelligent the empath becomes, the less tolerance they develop for manipulation disguised as love. So if you have someone in your life who loves deeply, listens sincerely, supports consistently, and remains patient during your worst moments, do not take that lightly. Because emotional safety is rare. And once destroyed, it is almost impossible to recreate artificially. An empath can survive without the people who hurt them. But many people cannot emotionally recover from losing someone who truly understood them. That is the irony. The empath everyone underestimated becomes the person they cannot replace. And by the time they realize it, the empath has already emotionally moved on. Most people completely misunderstand what happens inside an empath when they are emotionally hurt, because the damage is rarely visible in the beginning. An empath does not immediately become cold, distant, or angry. In fact, they often become even more patient, more understanding, and more emotionally available, because their natural instinct is to repair emotional tension rather than create it. That is what makes the situation psychologically dangerous. While other people react instantly to betrayal, empaths absorb emotional pain, quietly, and analyze it internally. They replay conversations in their mind, study changes in behavior, notice emotional inconsistencies, and try to convince themselves that the situation can still improve. They give repeated chances not because they are weak, but because they emotionally understand human imperfection better than most people. However, every disappointment leaves a psychological mark. Every ignored feeling, every manipulation disguised as love, every moment of emotional disrespect slowly exhausts the nervous system. Over time, the empath begins experiencing emotional fatigue, a condition where the mind becomes tired of carrying emotional weight for everyone else, while receiving little emotional safety in return. This is the stage most people fail to recognize, because the empath still appears calm on the surface. They still communicate normally, still help others, and still try to maintain peace, but internally something important is changing. The emotional energy that once flowed naturally toward the relationship begins to decrease. Their trust becomes cautious. Their emotional openness becomes guarded. Their mind slowly shifts from attachment to observation. Instead of emotionally chasing connection, they begin emotionally studying distance. This transformation is extremely important, because emotionally intelligent individuals do not disconnect impulsively. They disconnect after prolonged psychological disappointment. Once the empath realizes that their kindness is being exploited instead of valued, the brain starts adapting for self-protection. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop reacting emotionally to every problem. They stop begging for honesty from people who already understand the damage they are causing. At this point, many people wrongly assume the empath has become emotionally stronger for the relationship, when in reality the empath is preparing emotionally to survive without it. The silence becomes different. The energy becomes different. The emotional warmth that once filled every interaction slowly disappears. This is why people often realize the value of an empath too late. They become so accustomed to receiving emotional support, patience, understanding, and forgiveness that they mistake it as something permanent. They assume the empath will always remain emotionally available regardless of how much pain they experience. But human psychology does not work that way. Even the most compassionate mind eventually reaches emotional exhaustion. And when an empath finally reaches that limit, the detachment becomes extremely difficult to reverse because it was built slowly through accumulated emotional pain. By the time the empath emotionally lets go, they have already spent months or even years mentally grieving the relationship in silence. That is why their final distance feels so calm, so controlled, and so permanent, because the emotional goodbye happened internally long before the physical separation ever became visible. One of the biggest psychological mistakes people make is assuming that empathy automatically equals weakness. Many individuals believe that because an empath is patient, forgiving, emotionally expressive, or understanding, they can be manipulated without consequences. They assume kindness means emotional dependency, and they mistake compassion for lack of awareness. But emotionally intelligent people operate very differently from what most manipulators expect. Empaths are constantly observing emotional patterns, even during moments when they appear silent or emotionally calm. They notice shifts in tone, inconsistencies in behavior, passive disrespect, emotional dishonesty, and manipulation hidden beneath fake affection. The reason many empaths tolerate unhealthy behavior longer than others is not because they fail to recognize it, but because they naturally search for emotional explanations before making final judgments. They try to understand pain, instead of immediately condemning it. They attempt communication before disconnection. However, repeated emotional manipulation changes the psychological dynamic completely. When a person continuously lies, controls, gaslights, emotionally neglects, or exploits an empath's compassion, the empath slowly begins recognizing that their emotional energy is no longer creating connection, but feeding dysfunction instead. This realization becomes a turning point. Instead of emotionally reacting harder, the empath begins emotionally withdrawing. And this is where manipulation starts failing. Manipulative behavior survives through emotional access. It depends on triggering reactions such as fear, guilt, confusion, over-explaining, or emotional chasing. The manipulator feels powerful when they can influence another person's emotional state. But once the empath stops emotionally reacting the same way, the manipulator loses psychological control. That sudden calmness often confuses people because they mistake silence for weakness, when in reality silence can become emotional detachment. The empath is no longer fighting to be understood because they have already started understanding the situation clearly themselves. Their focus shifts from saving the relationship to protecting their mental stability. This psychological shift is powerful because emotionally detached people become difficult to control. The empath no longer seeks constant reassurance, no longer argues endlessly for honesty, and no longer sacrifices emotional peace to maintain unhealthy connections. Instead, they begin setting boundaries quietly and emotionally observing from a distance. The more emotionally mature the empath becomes, the less influence manipulation has over them. They start recognizing patterns faster, trusting actions more than words, and valuing emotional consistency over temporary affection. This transformation often shocks the people around them because they were emotionally dependent on the empath's patience. They expected endless forgiveness, endless understanding, and endless emotional availability. But once the empath mentally disconnects, the emotional environment changes completely. The warmth becomes limited. The emotional access disappears. The reactions stop. And suddenly the person who once felt emotionally powerful begins experiencing insecurity, anxiety, or regret because they can no longer control the emotional atmosphere. What makes this even more significant is that empaths rarely announce this transformation loudly. They simply become calmer, quieter, and emotionally unavailable to harmful behavior. Their greatest strength becomes emotional discipline. They no longer need revenge, constant closure, or dramatic confrontation because they finally understand that protecting their peace is more valuable than forcing loyalty from people who never respected their emotions in the first place. One of the most psychologically unsettling moments for a person, realizing that an empath they once took for granted has emotionally withdrawn completely. Most people expect revenge to look loud, emotional, dramatic, or destructive, but the true power of an empath appears in the moment they stop emotionally participating altogether. Unlike manipulative individuals who seek control through chaos, guilt, arguments, or emotional games, an emotionally exhausted empath often chooses silence and distance instead. This emotional withdrawal carries a unique, psychological weight because the empath was usually the emotional center of the connection. They were the listener during difficult moments, the calm voice during conflict, the person who remembered emotional details others ignored, and the one constantly offering reassurance, patience, support, and understanding even while struggling internally themselves. Over time, many people unconsciously become emotionally dependent on that energy without fully appreciating its value. They grow comfortable receiving emotional loyalty without giving equal emotional safety in return. But once the empath reaches emotional exhaustion, something changes permanently. The emotional access people once had suddenly disappears. The empath no longer reacts to manipulation, no longer argues for understanding, no longer over-explains feelings, and no longer sacrifices personal peace to maintain unhealthy relationships. At first, many people misinterpret this silence as temporary anger or emotional stubbornness. They assume the empath will eventually return to the same emotional availability as before. But emotional withdrawal from an empath is rarely impulsive. It is usually the final stage of prolonged emotional disappointment. By the time the empath disconnects externally, they have already spent months mentally processing betrayal, disappointment, emotional imbalance, and psychological fatigue internally. This is why their silence feels so calm and controlled. They are no longer emotionally fighting for the relationship because they have already emotionally accepted its reality. What makes this especially powerful is that absence often reveals emotional value more clearly than presence ever did. While the empath was constantly giving emotional support, many people failed to notice how much emotional stability they were receiving daily. But once that support disappears, emotional emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. Conversations feel colder. Emotional reassurance disappears. The sense of being deeply understood vanishes. And suddenly the person who once overlooked the empath's value begins feeling the emotional weight that the empath had silently carried for years. This creates psychological discomfort because humans often recognize emotional importance only after losing consistent access to it. The empath's withdrawal becomes a mirror that forces people to confront their own emotional behavior, selfishness, manipulation, or neglect. And unlike dramatic revenge, silent emotional detachment leaves no argument to fight against because the empath is no longer seeking emotional engagement. They simply move differently. Their energy becomes selective. Their attention becomes guarded. Their emotional investment becomes limited to people who bring peace instead of emotional damage. This transformation is what makes emotionally detached empaths so powerful. They no longer need to prove their worth, demand validation, or force understanding from emotionally careless people. Their calm distance becomes the consequence itself. And for many individuals, realizing too late that they lost someone who genuinely cared for them creates a deeper regret than any confrontation or punishment ever could. Severe emotional pain has the power to permanently transform the psychology of an empath, not by destroying their ability to feel, but by changing the way they protect their emotional energy. Before experiencing deep betrayal or repeated emotional disappointment, many empaths naturally move through life with open trust, emotional generosity, and a strong desire to help others heal. They often believe that patience, communication, understanding, and loyalty can repair almost any emotional situation. Because they feel emotions intensely, they also tend to give people more chances than most individuals would tolerate. However, repeated emotional wounds eventually force the mind into adaptation. Human psychology is designed for survival, and when emotional pain becomes continuous, the empath slowly develops emotional defense mechanisms that reshape their personality. This transformation is rarely loud or dramatic in the beginning. Instead, it appears through increased observation, emotional caution, and stronger awareness of behavioral patterns. The empath who once ignored red flags now notices them immediately. The person who once over-explained feelings now becomes more selective with emotional expression. The individual who once chased emotional closure now understands that not every person deserves continued access to their energy. Pain sharpens perception. After surviving manipulation, dishonesty, emotional neglect, or betrayal, empaths begin studying behavior more carefully than words. They learn that actions reveal emotional truth more accurately than promises ever can. This creates a new level of emotional intelligence because suffering teaches lessons that comfort never could. Over time, the empath becomes emotionally disciplined. They stop responding impulsively to every emotional trigger. They become calmer during conflict, quieter around fake behavior, and more comfortable walking away from emotionally harmful environments. What surprises many people is that this transformation often makes the empath appear stronger, colder, or more distant, when in reality they have simply learned the importance of emotional boundaries. They no longer confuse self-sacrifice with love. They no longer believe endless forgiveness automatically creates healthy relationships. And they no longer allow guilt to pressure them into tolerating emotional disrespect. This emotional evolution can feel intimidating to people who once benefited from the empath's unlimited patience because the empath is no longer emotionally easy to control. They recognize manipulation faster, detect emotional inconsistency earlier, and trust intuition more deeply. Instead of seeking validation from everyone around them, they begin protecting inner peace as a priority. Their social circle becomes smaller, their trust becomes earned instead of automatic, and their emotional investment becomes highly selective. But this transformation is not bitterness. It is psychological growth created through survival. The empath still cares deeply, still loves deeply, and still possesses emotional sensitivity, but now those qualities are guided by wisdom instead of emotional vulnerability alone. They understand that empathy without boundaries leads to emotional exhaustion, and kindness without self-respect attracts manipulation. As a result, the empath becomes emotionally balanced in a way many people never expected. The pain that was meant to break them ultimately strengthens their emotional awareness, self-control, and resilience. And once an empath reaches this stage of emotional maturity, they become incredibly difficult to deceive because suffering has already taught them the difference between genuine connection and emotional performance.